Chapter 898. Before I met the hidden official, I was still curious about what kind of extraordinary man he must be to be worthy of Sword Celestial Ning, the most powerful person in the world. Even in front of my brother Zhong, I expressed my doubts more than once. Until today, when I met him, I finally understood what it meant to be a match made in heaven. Yu Laro pulled the strings and they were a perfect couple. Only after meeting Sword Immortal Ning did I realize that all the women in the world are mediocre. When I met the hidden official with my own eyes, I realized what it means to be young and promising. I've wasted my time. I've lived so long, yet I've lived like a dog. Oh right, Mountain Lord Chen, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Suji Yu, and my Daoist name is Gusu, and I'm the aunt of a woman. Brother Zhong and I have the same temperament, and we hit it off at first sight. To be honest, the reason why I can become sworn brothers with Zhong Kuei and travel the Yi continent together is all thanks to the Sword Celestial Ning. Zhong Kuei looked at the fatty who looked sincere and spoke sincerely. He was quite pitiful. Ji Su had indeed questioned Chen Pingan many times. For example, this brat must be a big pig trotter with a bad stomach and could not eat coarse grains. He had only read a few sage books and did not pick up the good ones but the bad ones. He was not a gentleman at all and was good at sweet-talking. Ning Yaro's aptitude was too good and she definitely did not know the dangers of the mortal world. Moreover, she had grown up in the Great Wall of Sword Chi and was most likely a little girl who did not know the ways of the world. Then, a scholar from outside the Great Wall of Sword Chi stole the corner of the entire Great Wall of Sword Chi and was bewitched by Chen Pingan's sweet-talking. Since when had there been a lack of such incidents in the traveling immortals? Chapter 899. They got off the boat at a celestial ferry called the Inkline Ferry. The ferry was crowded with buildings, but most of them were newly built after the war. It was like a small town with a small river passing through the town. The river was quiet and calm. Shops stood on both sides of the river, but the business was poor. The ferry got its name because there was a kind of strange aquatic creature there in the early years. They looked like fish and snakes, but they were not snakes. They were very difficult to catch and died as soon as they came out of the water. They were slender and their backs were like an incline. They swam in the water in groups, and the inclines were like mountain ranges. However, after the war, there was no sign of this kind of aquatic creature in the river, so the Inkline Ferry did not live up to its name. Huang Yiyun brought her disciple Shui Huai and 2 guests from Mount Pu to attend the opening ceremony of the celestial capital mountain. The old woman and the young girl beside Yi Yunyun were the owners of the tea shed with the engagement shop by the Kailin River. The old woman was called Qiu Biyu, and her real body was an old dragon. She was almost 5,000 years old and used to be a nanny of the old Great Blasphemy Dragon Palace. She was one of the ministers of the emperor. She had a low position and power, and her real power was equivalent to half of the patriarch of the celestial family on the mountain. The young girl was called Hu Chuling. Her parents' surname was Hu Chuling, and her nickname was Vinegar. Chapter 900. In the ruins of the Great Desecration Dragon Palace in Tongya Continent, there was a white-clothed woman in the hall and a green-clothed man outside. The 2 neighbors reunited in a foreign land, but there was no harmonious atmosphere of meeting an old friend in a foreign land. In the Luorpa mountain of the Aquarius continent, on the main peak of the Spirit-Gathering Peak, on the first floor of the bamboo building, there was a long sword in its scabbard. Suddenly, the sword flashed and the unsheathed long sword left Luorpa mountain in a flash. The sword aura was like a rainbow as it suddenly swept out of Dallas Northern Peak. Wei Pai did not even have time to help cover the sword aura. Fortunately, the long sword pierced through the air very quickly. Human cultivators would at most catch a glimpse of it and it would disappear without a trace. Chapter 901. Celestial Capital Mountains Banished Immortal Peak, Flower Sweeping Terrace. Pei Qian and Shui Huai, who were about to use the Q-ask fist, were separated by 10 feet. Beside Chen Pingan, Kui Dongshan had his hands on the back of his head, ready to applaud and cheer for Grand Senior Sister at any time. Xiao Mo did not come as he was busy at the Treasure Drop Beach. He had to build a thatched cottage beside the Qingyi River. Xiao Mo was not particularly interested in the Qi-asking fist. He only said that since they were guests, young master and Miss Pei should be gentle with their punches so as not to hurt the harmony. In any case, it was just flattery. You can even do this. Chapter 902. After Yi Yunyun left, Sui Yuyu didn't say a word. She immediately rode her sword down the mountain and went to the treasure landing beach by the Qingyi River. Qiu Ju brought Hu Chuling along to tour the banished immortal peak. The two matches between Luopa Mountain and Piyu Mountain had broadened the old woman's horizons. Most importantly, the winner wasn't complacent, while the loser wasn't discouraged. This made the old woman feel that it was especially valuable. After the perilous encounter at the Great Desecration Dragon Palace and witnessing Chen Ping'an's performance, the old woman had a very good impression of the immortal capital mountain. Chapter 903. The moon was bright and the stars were dim. Sho Qing's ears moved slightly. He turned his head and looked into the distance. He said, "Master, Xiu Hu is here." Li Yeho nodded and reminded them telepathically, "Remember to pay attention to your words. No matter what Mr. Kui says to me, just listen to him. Don't mind him." Maid Huang Huan, who was adjusting the strings of the zither, followed Huang Huan's line of sight and looked into the distance. She could vaguely see a snow-white figure in the distance. It seemed to be riding the wind while sticking close to the ground. Suddenly, the figure lifted up again and again. Huang Huan's line of sight continued to rise. The bright moon hung in the sky, and the mustard seed's back was facing the full moon. That person sped up and rode the wind, suddenly crashing straight towards the mountain peak. He was like a person under the bright moon, banished to the mortal world. Chapter 904. Little Dragon Qiu's ancestral mountain was shaped like a Ruyi scepter. Under the ancient pine, Sichu Mengjing seemed to be sure that Chen Ping'an would come here. She closed her eyes to rest and waited patiently for the young hidden official's guest, Little Dragon Qiu. Huang Ting was a bit bored, so he called Linghu Jianyu to chat with him. However, the girl didn't dare to be rash in the presence of the Dragon-Beard Immortal. No matter what Huang Ting asked, she just nodded or shook her head. She didn't dare to disturb the Grand Master of the upper sect. As a cultivator who came down from the mountain, she was familiar with all kinds of strange stories about the great Dragon Qiu of the upper sect. There were endless stories about the Dragon-Beard Immortal. He was a good friend of Zhu Shunji, one of the top 10 in the central region. He attended the banquet of the Green Immortal Mountain in the Bamboo Sea Cave. The flower goddess of the blessed land of 100 flowers was his confidant. He traveled in the inverted hanging mountain and had a good talk with Jiao Zhen, who had a dragon-beard horsetail whisk and whose grandmaster was the invincible Baek Okekyung building. He stayed in the Water Fairy Palace, one of the 4 private residences in the inverted hanging mountain. It was said that he was very close to the Cloud Sign Fairy of the Rain Dragon sect. He was also a good friend of the Ascendant State Cultivator who called himself the Master of the 37th Peak. At the beginning of cultivation, the old immortal called him Dragon-Beard Immortal because of the huge gap between their realms. Chapter 905. At the end of the year, there was another heavy snowfall and countless broken jade. A military ferry of the Great Quan dynasty had already sailed far away from the northern border. In a few hours, it would arrive at the celestial capital mountain ferry. An old man wearing an old and heavy fox fur coat was traveling north. Occasionally, he would leave his house and walk to the railing to look at the winding mountains and rivers in the snow. To see the signs of a bumper harvest, the celestial algae floated in the air. It was no longer the bleak scene of the barren fields at the foot of the mountain, countless dried bones, apes climbing withered vines, and cranes looking at broken tablets. Chapter 906. Before going up the mountain, Yao Xianji wanted to put the fox fur coat on his grandfather, but Chen Ping'an shook his head with a smile, hinting that it was unnecessary. Afterwards, Yao Xianji discovered that in this season of melting snow, the snow was white and covered in silver. The mountain was frozen and there were no clouds, but the mountain breeze was warm and gentle, making people not feel the slightest bit cold. Moreover, the snow on the mountain path below their feet had already melted by itself, as if there was an invisible mountain god opening a path for the 3 of them. The old man was in high spirits. He smiled and said, "Let's go up the mountain." He had spent his whole life in the army at the border of Daquan. Other than the few times he went to the capital to meet the emperor, he did not move much. He did not travel or explore the world. The number of famous mountains and rivers that the old man had set foot on could be counted with one's fingers. Thinking back to the days when he was a young scout at the border, he chased the enemy with a bow and sword covered in snow. Every time the river froze, the sound of broken jade could be heard when the horses stepped on it. Chapter 907. Yu Dynasty, Luo Jing. Dai Yuan, a practitioner of the Gold Core realm from the Green Seal sect, had just returned from the imperial palace. On his way back, his carriage passed by the magnificent temple of Jadeite. This Gold Core realm executive of the Yu dynasty did not expect to have anything to do with the national master, who was an outstanding beauty. Since his cultivation was not high enough, if he really wanted to knock on the door and pay a visit, he would not be turned away. But what was the point of drinking tea and looking at it? Moreover, Lu Bilong's cultivation was very high and his background was unknown. Dai Yuan didn't dare to look at him. Dai Yuan put down the curtains and sighed. For some reason, he missed Little Dragon Chio's water deity. However, Dai Yuan didn't notice that a young man in white holding a green bamboo cane was lying on the roof of the carriage with his legs crossed. He seemed to be protecting Dai Yuan. The consecrators of the Yu dynasty were divided into internal and external affairs. They were roughly equivalent to the registered and unregistered consecrators of the immortal sects. Chapter 908. Treasure Vase Continent's southeast coastal region. A young man and woman strolled past a county town's biding shop, and then went to the wine shop next door, and picked a table against the wall. The man ordered a catty of wine, and a few side dishes, while the woman ordered a plate of salted preserved plums. The man raised his head and looked at the poem written on the wall. The woman glanced at it, picked up a plum, and chewed on it. It was really sour. The man took out a book from his book box, and placed it on the table. While drinking, he flipped through a book on physiognomy. He liked to read books, and usually even read wind horn, bird zhon, jiu shu techniques. He had dabbled in them. To put it nicely, it was never a burden to have more skills. When out in the world, one more skill meant one more bowl of rice. The woman's eyebrows were like a winding mountain. When she had something on her mind, a pair of limpid eyes seemed to have clouds and mist surrounding the mountain. Chapter 909. Above the sea, not long after the Sword Immortals joined forces to drag the moon, a mountain ferry hovered in the air. Nearby, there were two great Lee sword boats escorting it. It was huge and covered the sky. It floated above Osmanthus Island. All the immortal ferries in the Aquarius continent had been requisitioned by the Confucian Temple and the Dali Imperial Court. Osmanthus Island, which belonged to the Fan family in Old Dragon City, was no exception. However, not long after the meeting in the Confucian Temple ended, the Fu family in Old Dragon City rented a new ferry from the Baijin continent and the Liuxia continent to maintain the trade routes. Although this kind of thing was considered opportunistic, it was allowed by the Confucian Temple in the central region, so it was not against the rules. Therefore, the few immortals who could build cross-continent ferries on their own made a lot of money. Chapter 910. Luo Po Mountain, the Mountain Gate. Chen Lingjun looked around, and while there was no one else, he secretly took out a bottle of wine, and with a twist of his wrist, 2 wine bowls appeared, and he threw them to the new gatekeeper across the table. A little boy in green, and a young Daoist, sat opposite each other. One stepped on the bench, the other took off his boots, and sat cross-legged. Chen Lingjun leaned forward, extended his arm, and bumped into the young Daoist. The latter drank a big mouthful of wine, and laughed. "I'm fine with it." Chapter 911. Uploaded late. Ascension City. Business was good today. 2 batches of customers came one after another. Just as Fan Dash and Wang Xinshui took their seats, Sichu Longqiu and Luo Zheni came along with a few women. Zheng Dafeng did not even need to give him a look. Fan Dash and the rest took the initiative to give up their seats at the last table and went to the roadside to drink. They wanted to listen to stories about immortals fighting and bedwalking with their brother Dafeng. Unexpectedly, Zheng Dafeng had already sat down at the table. Chapter 9:12. When the three of them left Wukue City, whistles could be heard from the top of the city wall. So what if Ning Yarrow was there? There was still the second shopkeeper. In the Great Wall of Sword Aura, everyone knew that Ning Yarrow still respected the second shopkeeper outside the Ning mansion. As for whether the second shopkeeper would kneel on the washboard when they returned to the Ning mansion, it was none of their business. On the way, Chen Pinggan smiled and said, "Let's go to the Fujian Lake first." There were two immortal ferries in the Ascension City. The northernmost one was the Summer Ferry in the Summer City. The other one was at the foot of the Purple Mansion Mountain where Deng Liang cultivated. There was a ferry built on the Fujian Lake and named it the Lost Soul Ferry. One was in the north and the other was in the south. Chapter 9:13. Early in the morning, Chen Pinggan reached for the jade token of the hidden official in his sleeve. With a single step, he arrived at the steps outside the Summer Palace. It was different from the Summer Palace, which had its doors closed all day long. It was more like a government office. Unlike the vassal cities, there were no gatekeepers. It was not a hindrance to visit, but it was fine as long as one did not wander around. If one had something to say, they would say it and leave as soon as they were done. It was impossible to get the hidden official's line of sword cultivators to serve wine to guests. In the early days of the Summer Palace, other than the eldest sword immortal, even Chen Shi and Qi Tingji could not step through the doors. Before Ning Yarrow landed in Ascension City and took over the position of hidden official, she had never set foot in the Summer Palace. Chapter 9:14. The Quan Residence. Chen Pinggan brought Xiao Mo through the corridors to pay a visit to Lord Gao Yi. Lord Gao Yi stood at the door to welcome them, joking, "How does it feel to tour your own territory? Not bad, right?" Nowadays in Ascension City, who doesn't know that the place with the most supporters of hidden official Chen Pinggan isn't even the Summer Palace where there are few sword cultivators, but this Quan Residence which is famous for its reputation. There was once a young sword cultivator who tried to steal couplets but failed, and directly said. Chapter 9:15. Young Ningxing, whose neck was being strangled, blushed. He could only hit the arm of the person behind him with all his might, hoping that the other party would be merciful. They were all strangers, there was no need to fight. The young man in white seemed to be very angry. Not only did he not loosen his arm, but he also took a step forward and pulled Brother Mu Maro so hard that his back was almost level with the ground. Young Ningxing was really dizzy. He said with difficulty, "Good brother, discipline him, discipline him. Don't leave him in the lurch. This student of yours is born with great strength. He is too heavy-handed." He could only see a young man with a red mole in between his eyebrows. His face was full of killing intent. The young man in white turned to look at Zheng Dafeng. He bent his knees and squatted. First, he twisted his arms so hard that young Ningxing rolled his eyes. He did not care whether he was dead or alive. He just smiled brightly and said, "Brother Dafeng." Zheng Dafeng smiled and said, "It has been many years since we last met. Brother Kui is still a handsome young man." Chapter 9:16. Chen Pinggan stood up alone and strolled along the fields. An old friend had come. It was Qi Shou, who had rushed over from Wukue City. He was the current leader of the criminal officers. Qi Shou went straight to the point. "If you didn't come to the spring residence to find me, I would have been worried. Why don't you take the initiative to come and get scolded?" Who didn't know that the young hidden official of the Summer Refuge Palace was full of strange words? It was as if he had a large basket of natal flying swords, each one of them stabbing at the heart. Chen Pinggan smiled. "Brother Qi and I are close friends. Now that Brother Qi has been promoted again, I can't wait to flatter you. How would I dare to criticize a newly promoted criminal officer?" The two of them walked side by side on the fields. Qi Shou said, "I heard that the previous criminal officer is called Hao Su. When Ning Yarrow returned to Ascension City last time, she didn't tell me the details of your trip to the wilderness. So much so that I only know his name now. Chapter 9:17. After Lu Chen left the cooling sect of the North Continent, he did not return to the Beko Kekyang building immediately. Instead, he went to the Artemisia Kingdom and met the scholar with the surname Chen at the Dongxian Street. Then, he sneaked back to the Aquarius continent to meet an old friend who was of a higher level than him but whose identity could not be underestimated. After crossing the sea from the North Continent and heading south, he reached the skies above the Aquarius continent. As expected, the sage of the Confucian temple who was in charge of the sky canopy chatted with Lu Chen for a while. Lu Chen felt that the conversation was short and affectionate, but it was a pleasant one. As for what the other party thought, Lu Chen did not care. In the Yuzhang County of Hong Province, there was a newly established Sefu Institute. The first chief official of the Sefu Institute was a person from the capital named Lin Zhangcheng. Chapter 9:18. In Die Xiandu Temple, there was a stream in the peach forest. The water was so clear that one could see the bottom. A tall old Daoist priest and a young fat man were sitting on small stools. They had their pants rolled up and were barefoot in the stream. One of them was drinking wine, while the other was holding a large handful of freshly picked lotus seeds. Fatty Yang asked, "Old son, why did you lend the sword to Bai Yi?" Ah Liang said that sword cultivators like us need a long sword to rely on the heavens for thousands of miles. How could someone like you give away such an immortal sword? Now look, I heard that there are many immortals in White Jade Capital who don't respect you, Old Sunday. They said that your relationship with our Xuanju temple is like that of a withered tree. Listen, how infuriating. When Dong Huafu talked to me about this, I was so angry that I almost went to White Jade Capital with him. I wanted to get back at them for you, Old Sunday. Unfortunately, my cultivation level is too low now. I'm afraid that I won't succeed in the Q-sword seeking, and will instead embarrass the Xuanju temple. The old temple master, as the leader of the Sword Celestial sect, had the same level of swordsmanship as Taoism. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to sit on the 5th in the world seat. Priest Sun sneered, "Just say it. I don't like to beat around the bush." Chapter 9:19. At the sky canopy in the center of the five-colored world, 2 streaks of sword radiance rose from the Ascension City and soared into the clouds. Between the heaven and the earth, the clouds were stirred up by the sword aura and huge whirlpools were formed. The bright sword radiance drew an arc between the clouds and the soil. When it was about the same height as the sky canopy door, the sword radiance suddenly stopped tens of thousands of miles away. In an instant, 2 figures appeared. One wore a jade hairpin and wore a green robe. The other wore a yellow hat and green shoes and held a mountain staff. The 2 sword cultivators each turned into a dozen streaks of sword radiance and rushed towards the door. They were using the same escape technique. Their speed was even faster than the drifting cloud boat. A lean old man in a Confucian robe stroked his beard and smiled. "I have to admit that sword cultivators are more carefree when it comes to traveling. Their sword radiance flashes and they are as fast as lightning. They are not restrained by the heavens and the earth. Just looking at them gives people a feeling of straightforwardness." Chapter 9:20. Chen Pinggan accompanied Xiaomi on her inspection of the ferry when 2 managers of the ferry approached them. Because she had to participate in the sect celebration, she was temporarily in charge of the wind kite ferry. She slowly walked over and stopped. Her bearing was graceful as she bowed to Chen Pinggan. "Greetings, sir." As the second manager of the ferry appointed by the young mountain master, old immortal Jiao cleaned himself up from head to toe. His appearance was thin and his hair was white as snow. He looked more and more like an otherworldly expert. The old immortal had brought out his best attire. He was wearing a Daoist robe and a pair of cloud-stepping shoes. There was a small jade chime on his waist. This was a spiritual tool that the blind old Daoist had bought from a straw shop in Dragon Riding Alley in his early years. The design on the jade chime was simple and unadorned. There was a line of small characters carved on it. "Heavenly wind blows the chime, I recite the yellow court, the sound of gold and jade vibrates, the heavens respect each other." Jiao Cheng stood beside Chang Ming. His position was slightly behind Chen Pingan. He greeted Chen Pingan and said respectfully, "Greetings, Hillmaster." As for the pair of lotus silk cloud stepping shoes on the old immortal's feet, it was one of the gifts from Mr. Xiao Mo. Chapter 921. Elder Changming dragged Xiaomi along for a stroll. Chen Pingan strolled with Jiao Cheng and asked with a smile, "Are you used to your current identity?" Jiao Cheng immediately clasped his hands and said emotionally, "Thanks to Mountain Lord's high regard, I was able to hold an important position. I can't slack off, but I don't dare to do anything unnecessary. After thinking about it, I can only adhere to one principle: see more, smile more, speak less, act less, and show less. My cultivation is shallow to begin with. I'm just in the Dragon Gate realm. Forget about helping Fengyuan Ferry in its hour of need, I might not even be able to do the icing on the cake. I just thought that I wouldn't delay things and would take one step at a time. I would try my best to do my best for Luo Po Mountain. I can't let down the Mountain Master's high hopes." Luo Po Mountain's Zhong Changming and God of Fortune Wei Wenlong were temporary helpers on Wind Kite Ferry. They would return to Luo Po Mountain after the sect's celebration. According to Kui Dongshan's arrangement, the people in charge of the ferry were Jiao Cheng and Zhong Jiazhen, who were in charge of receiving people. Chapter 922. The chapter was uploaded late, sorry. Just as Xiao Mo was about to draw his sword, a faint voice sounded between heaven and earth, like rustling leaves falling, revealing a strong sense of loneliness. "It's really you." Xiao Mo waited quietly for the next sentence. After a while, the voice sounded again, "You all go back, it's useless to meet." Xiao Mo sneered, and he no longer talked nonsense with the fellow who he had only met a few times. He walked forward slowly and raised the long sword in his hand. "Mister, just follow me. In at most 15 minutes, you can see the other party's real body." Xiao Mo first nailed a long sword into the ground, and the entire empty and lonely world changed color. It was like a picture scroll, but because of the long time, it appeared yellow. Chapter 923. The Wind Kite Ferry was already close to the celestial capital mountain. As expected, the celestial with the title Dragon Gate of the Steel Tree Mountain had explored the surrounding mountains and rivers for thousands of miles. Everywhere, there were broken walls and dilapidated scenes. Yu Feng returned to the secret snow peak and saw the disciple chatting with Zheng Yuqian on the railing of a viewing platform. It was probably because of the old saying of women being more outgoing. Tan Yingju was saying to Zheng Yuqian, "You can't do anything, but you can look for junior martial uncle more than anyone else." As expected, those few senior martial brothers and sisters, including himself, were the senior martial uncles of many Steel Tree Mountain cultivators. Chapter 924. The chapter was uploaded late. Sorry. The clouds were burning in the sky, and the sunset stretched for thousands of miles. A dragon boat named Overturned Ink docked at an immortal ferry. A group of people was preparing to change to the ferry and head to the kingdom of Huangliang. The leader of the group was a little boy in green clothes who swaggered off the boat. His two sleeves were flapping in the air. Beside him was a young girl with a hand-copied inkstone hanging from her waist and a green bamboo cane in her hand. Behind him was a young man in a scholarly robe and a yellow-clothed old man who looked like a retainer. His appearance was strange, and he had eagle eyes. Because he was skinny, he looked like he was wearing an extremely loose robe. Chapter 925. Qing Tong, whose sleeves were dragging on the ground, seemed to be instantly shattered by a punch, and his body suddenly split into two. Qing Tong was no longer in the posture of immortality with extremely long sleeves and ethereal qi. A young spirit body appeared on the spot. It was an old man with a burly figure, muscular arms, and snow-white hair. He stood barefoot. The old man showed a slightly surprised expression. His feet on the smooth mirror-like ground, he stepped straight back for more than 100 feet before he stopped and shook his wrist. Just this ordinary subtle movement was like a dragon shaking its scales. His fist intent flowed like a river, and it showed a kind of golden phenomenon visible to the naked eye. The fist aura was as thick as water, shining brightly. This old martial artist who claimed to be half a god was like an immortal god standing in the smoke of incense. Ching Tong, who had tempered his body to the extreme, seemed to be quite surprised at the moment. A pure martial artist who was only at the first level of Chi Flourishing Realm, especially a 10th level martial artist who had fallen from the first level of the Pure Realm, had such great strength? Chapter 926. Before he received the punch, an ancient armor suddenly appeared on Ching Tong's young spirit body. This punch was too strange. Since he could not defeat it, and at the same time, he was destined to be unable to avoid it, Ching Tong could only choose to take it head-on. Outside of the snow-white robe, he added another set of armor to protect his body. It was obvious that Ching Tong did not think that he could take the punch completely without relying on external objects with his half-godly martial body. After the punch, the armor on the white-haired old man's body shattered like a mirror and shot out like countless shooting stars. Moreover, the old man's burly figure began to fall to the ground, but it was not a straight line. It was because this world was like a crumpled ball of paper that a child casually grabbed. In this place, the direction of the flow of the river of time had already exceeded the common sense of the world. The so-called directions were all fabricated. North, south, east, west, up, down, left, and right were all twisted and folded. As a result, many seemingly adjacent worlds were thousands of miles away from each other. Many seemingly thousands of miles away were actually only a millimeter or a step away from each other. Chapter 927. Chen Pinggan had originally planned on heading straight for the underwater residence of the Duke of Spirit Origin, but he changed his mind at the last moment and decided to go somewhere else. With a single thought, he ignored the distance and stood beneath a wutong tree in the capital of the Great Yuan dynasty. Raising his head and looking into the distance, Chen Pinggan took another step and arrived in a black and white imperial palace. He seemed to have entered a realm of no man. This Great Yuan dynasty was founded by Water De. Last time, Chen Pinggan had gone to the Cloud Palace of the Chongxian Bureau to discuss business with the Lu Emperor. At the time, the Emperor had only brought a young prince with him. His name was Lu Jun, and he was now the Crown Prince. Chen Pinggan gave Prince Lu Jun a handwritten copy of his teacher's calligraphy as well as a handwritten copy of a fist manual. It was the mountain-quaking fist written by Ji Yu, the ultimate warrior of the Great Seal dynasty. As for Lu Jun's talent in cultivation and martial arts, it was actually very ordinary. Back then, Chen Pinggan had treated him honestly and truthfully, not using those polite words to brush him off. In the end, the two of them became master and disciple in secret. Before daybreak, there was still some time before the morning court. Emperor Liu Yang woke up early and found it difficult to fall asleep. He simply had the eunuchs light the lamps and sat cross-legged on a heated bed in a small warm room. As he read through memorials, he rubbed his forehead. The warm room was paved with earth coils. Even in the depths of winter, it was as warm as spring. Occasionally, the emperor would order the palace to stop burning charcoal. He said that the cold would refine the muscles and bones and strengthen the body. On the other hand, the princes of the Lu family who were studying on the southern veranda of the Wenying Palace would only be given a hand warmer if they encountered a bone-chilling cold that only happened once every few decades. Otherwise, they would have to quietly stomp their feet and shiver while reading loudly. It was just studying. It couldn't be said to be hard work, but it wasn't easy. Chapter 928. Suddenly, Yang Ji asked in his mind, "Can I talk to that Taoist friend?" Chen Pinggan stopped and adjusted his bamboo hat. He seemed to be discussing something with someone. After a short moment, the sound of a camel's bell resounded from afar. The sound of a camel's bell was long and drawn out on an ancient path of yellow sand. A person wearing a hedgerow on his head and a jade-green robe led a white camel over unhurriedly. The sun hung high in the sky and baked the earth. Even the light was distorted. The drinkers who were playing finger-guessing games in the shop all looked away and whispered to each other. They held the camel's arm and revealed a white, lotus-like wrist. They began to guess the woman's age. They wondered what she looked like. They wondered if she was a relative of the wine master. They wondered how old she was, and if she was married. However, it was quickly overshadowed by another strange scene. In the distant sky, there were carriages and horses passing by mountain tops, heading toward the wine shop as fast as lightning. The patrolling formation was very large. There were civil and military officers, goddesses, and palace maids, and there were at least 20 people. The ostentation was just like the 8 prefectures in those court cases. They held imperial swords in their hands, and beat gongs to clear the way. There were officials carrying 2 placards: the mountain was solemn and the water was still, and strangers should avoid them. The biggest difference was that one was on the ground, and the other was in the sky. Chapter 929. In the center of the Aquarius continent, there was a majestic palace. The Changchun Marquis residence, Bixiao Palace. There were many plaques hanging in the palace. The merit given by the mountain elder of the Lakeview Academy was eternal, the poem written by the head of the Yunlin Jiang family, and the divine capital Pinghan from Linlu Academy. Even Liu Qingfeng, the former Minister of Rites in the capital of the Great Li dynasty, made an exception when he was alive and gave him a piece of calligraphy. It was the 4 words plowing fields and reading rain, written in an imposing manner. In the Aquarius continent, Yang Hua, who was given the title of Marquis by the Confucian temple, was the water godhead venerable. Chen Pinggan did not directly look for Yang Hua. Chapter 930. Sage of Rites drank a bowl of wine in the shop and asked, "What do you mean?" The old scholar laughed so hard that his face was wrinkled. He said, "This is a rare opportunity. Let me take a break and drink a little more. An emperor doesn't need hungry soldiers." The old scholar was in charge of the affairs in the Confucian temple and the Merit Forest. It was not too much to say that he took a break from the busy work. Sage of Rites hesitated and reminded him, "Remember, don't push your luck. If the Confucian temple can't do anything to you, I'll go to Chen Pinggan." There were very few people who could make Sage of Rites remind them like this. Chapter 931. In a small county in Huangting country, the name of the county was Suiyan, meaning peace and safety. It belonged to the Yang Province Prefecture, and the Yang Province Prefecture was the place that produced the most number of Zhuangyuan and Jinsha in the Yellow Court Nation. This county didn't have any large residences, but there were many scholarly families. Before Chen Pinggan entered the county, he saw a literary tower that stood on top of a small mountain. Since ancient times, places with a flourishing literary culture were like this. One would see the Wenchang Tower before seeing the city. Qing Tong spread out his spiritual sense and looked around the county. It did not seem like a place. With Qing Tong's state and vision, he should have seen some clues. However, there was not even a river granny in the rivers and streams around the county. The Riki in the county was extremely thin, and the fate of martial arts was even worse. It could be completely ignored. There were signs of literary fate, but it was not a big deal. Most of it was a kind of continuous inheritance under the protection of the ancestors. It came from some imperial plaques and buildings, as well as the plaques in the ancestral halls that hung Jinsha. There were also some in the shabby alleys and poor families. Qing Tong became more and more confused. Could it be that he was blind? Was there a grand cultivator at the top of the mountain or a sage of merit living in seclusion here and deliberately hiding the secret of heaven? Qing Tong could not help but ask, "Who are we looking for this time?" Chapter 932. Chen Pinggan didn't step over the threshold into the Hall of Swords. After all, it was the ancestral hall of Xiang Prefecture. He turned around and said with a smile, "Let's go to the kitchen to broaden our horizons." Inside, there were portraits of the ancestral masters. The one in the middle was Wu Yi wearing a daoist robe and stepping on clouds. Other than that, the portraits of the past masters were lined up on the left and right. Tomorrow at Celestial Capital Mountain, there would also be a portrait of Chen Pinggan hanging in the middle of the ancestral hall of Qingping Sword Sect. When Qing Tong moved, he turned his head and glanced at the inscribed board. Hall of Swords. In the books, generals and chivalrous heroes often had this kind of stretching out their hands and pressing their swords to shout. Chapter 933. Outside the courtyard. Xiao Luan was trembling with fear as she accompanied Wu Yi. She did not know the identity of the green-robed woman. She could not be the legendary female sword immortal Ning Yarrow, right? But the female cultivator in front of her was not carrying a sword or a sword sheath. Furthermore, if she was Ning Yarrow, why would she need to cover her face? The news of Ning Yarrow leaving the Five Colors world and appearing in Daeli's capital had already spread out in the mountain and river's official circles. But the Aquarius continent seemed to have a tacit understanding. No mountain dared to write about this. Chapter 934. At the peak of Northern Peak's cloud-padding mountain. An ancient pine tree towered into the sky. A man reclined on a white jade couch beneath it. He held his chin with one hand, as if he was sleeping and smiling. He wore a snow-white robe and a pair of cloud shoes. A ribbon was tied around his waist and a golden earring hung from his ear. Gods, immortals, ghosts, it was as beautiful as a painting. It was rumored that the 5 mountain lords of the Aquarius continent each had their own style. Chapter 935. Mount Sway in the central region. A deity in golden armor holding a sword in both hands opened his eyes slowly on the mountain peak. This deity's real name was Juyu, and his godly title was Grand Ritual. He was the most powerful deity in the 9 continents of the world. Juyu sized up the green-robed swordsman who was standing thousands of miles away. Chapter 936. Walking out of the River of Time, Qing Tong looked around and asked suspiciously, "Why didn't you return to subduing Yarrow Tower directly? Is there a mountain god from Aquarius continent that you want to meet?" Chen Pingan shook his head and said, "I have never been here before, but someone came up with this idea and asked me to take care of a guest, so I came here to send someone off." Qing Tong was even more puzzled. Who could tell you what to do? Not far away, there was a sparkling place, a pavilion was hidden in the shade of green trees, and a few melodious chimes could be heard from above. Chen Pingan said, "Let's go ahead and wait for them." Chapter 937. At the Fen River Temple, Chen Pingan and Qing Tong were looking at different sceneries. Both of them focused on different sceneries, so they decided to go first. When Qing Tong finished looking around the various halls, he realized that Chen Pingan was no longer in the Hebo temple. Walking out of the temple, Qing Tong saw a man in a green robe sitting on a small bamboo chair under the shade of the willow beside the big pond. He was casting a fishing rod. Qing Tong walked over and asked, "Are there any more bamboo chairs?" Chen Pingan put his finger to his mouth and signaled Qing Tong to lower his voice. Then, he twisted his wrist and a small bamboo chair appeared. He passed it to Qing Tong. "You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories,